Great to see you here. Now we're continuing with the 10-step approach, and we look at the 10 steps, or the part of the 10 steps in the planning process step. We look at, first of all the items, the different steps that are included in planning, and then I will look deeper into each step so that you have an idea of all the actions that we have to take, all the things that have to be done during each step. So we have the planning process step. We start step 2 of the 10-step process, which is about requirements, scope, WBS, work packages and activities. Step 3 is about roles and responsibilities, and we also look at estimation of duration and cost of the activities and the work packages, and we also use PERT, program evaluation and review technique, which is about adding uncertainty to the estimates. Step 4 is about dependencies and different diagramming methods. We can use the arrow diagramming method or the precedence diagramming method, but we will also talk about the critical path method to determine early start, early finish, and so on of all the activities, and of course the critical path and the project duration. Then we go to the project schedule and the Gantt chart. On the Gantt chart we add the resources, we have an evaluation of the resources, and we resolve possible issues. Step 7 is about project cost and budget, and we finish the planning step with the risk management. Risk management, very important when we are looking at projects because we have a lot of uncertainty there. Let's have a look at step 2. We look here at the requirements, the scope, the WBS, the work packages and the activities. This is typically part of the scope and schedule management, as we've seen it before when we considered the different knowledge areas. After approving the charter and the project can start, we must determine all the requirements that must be realized. Once the requirements have been determined and approved, we determine the scope, which is the work to be completed, and create WBS up to the level of work packages. In order to be able to plan the project, we have to decompose the project up to activity level. And once we have the activities, we can go to the next step. In step 3, we will be looking at roles and responsibilities, and we will be making estimates using normal classical evaluation or PERT or 3-point evaluations. Once the packages and activities have been determined, we can assign resources to those activities. We have to identify that the people or the resources, material resources that we allocate to those activities have the possibility to create the deliverables. So when we need a pilot of a 737, we need a pilot certified for 737, and of course a 737 Boeing airplane that the pilot can use to fly from A to B. We look at the resources. Like I said, they have the possibilities, they have to have the experience, and typically we give leadership to the person with the highest qualifications, with the best skills. On the other hand, we have to take into account, like I already said before in my example, that resources relate to human and material resources. We have people, but we also have machines, equipment, and so on. We have to consider all of them. We also have work packages and activities that we have to estimate. We can use the classical fixed duration estimate and fixed cost estimate, but we can also include uncertainty and probability using the PERT or the 3-point estimation techniques. Once we have this, we have the activities, we know how long they take, how much they cost, and now we can create the dependencies. We can identify the dependencies and create the arrow diagramming method, or the arrow diagram, or the precedence diagram, or a Gantt chart, depending on what techniques we are using. Now the activities we know from the WBS, but the WBS only shows their logical relationships. And what we have to do, we have to determine the chronological dependencies. The dependencies saying when I can start with a certain activity, I have to have completed some predecessors. And that predecessor information is about the chronology of those dependencies. I cannot plant a tree if I didn't make a hole in the ground first. Now, based on the dependencies, we can build a network diagram, and we can either use the arrow diagramming method or the precedence diagramming method. Typically, PMI, and in most cases, people are using the precedence diagramming method. Nevertheless, the arrow diagramming method is also still valuable, is still valid, and it will give you also a correct network when you do it properly. We can also use PERT here. We can have, let's say, uncertain durations, expected duration and a standard deviation. We can use those also in the calculations here. Once we have the schedule, we can create the projects. When we have the network, basically, we can create the project schedule, which is typically done on a Gantt chart. Now, basically, the Gantt chart is a calendar type activity, and we can put the activities there in what we call early or late start positions. So we will have different Gantt charts that we can develop. We can develop a Gantt chart with all the activities in early start position, and we can develop a Gantt chart with all the activities in late start position. Now, the Gantt chart is like a calendar, and you put there all those activities, the start time, the end time, and also the slack. We look at resources and conflict resolution because we put those activities in the Gantt chart. We already identify the resources, but now we will be adding the resources to the schedule. And basically, when we are adding those resources to the schedule, it may happen that some resources are working on activities in parallel. Now, we only looked at this element as an individual activity, but the combination may lead to some conflicts. When we look at the resources here on the Gantt chart, we can identify when the resources are overutilized. And it means overutilization means that they're allocated to work on the project for more time than they have been allocated. If you receive a resource for 4 hours per day, half a day, you cannot use that resource for more than 4 hours. Now, sometimes when you have resources dedicated to your project, you may include overtime, but overtime always leads to a reduction of performance, and people, when they work too much, they will not perform properly anymore. Keeping people on the project, it will just reduce their output, and it will not help you. You will only have to pay more if you have to pay them by the hour, and it's better to see that the people work exactly the time that they need. I'm not against overtime, but in planning, I'm not trying to use overtime because then I'm already losing a certain amount of slack, which I would have available later. Now, the thing is what we can do, we can adjust the planning, we can move the activities until not further than they reach their late finish time. So basically we can use the slack, we can move the start time, we can extend the activity, or we can have a combination of both. We call it smoothing or leveling depending on the result. When we level the resources, we don't increase the duration of the project. On the other hand, when we smooth the resources, we will not add extra time to the duration of the project. On the other hand, when we are leveling, there we will have an extension of the project duration basically two elements, two possibilities are there. And at the end of this step, we have the resources and the schedule baseline. Now we find a third baseline. Before we had the early start, the late start, and now we find the planned start. We have the actual time, start and finish, that we are planning those activities. And these are the elements we're going to use later. We're going to calculate the cost and the budget now. The Gantt chart and early state start, late start and planned start can now be used to determine the cost of the project. Each activity has a specific cost and we add it to the Gantt chart, and helping or with that information, when we look at every period, we can estimate how much money we need for every period during the project. And when we add all of those, we have also the cumulative cost, the cumulative budget. We call the periodically amounts that we need. We call it the time phase budget, and the other one is the cumulative budget, but it's also called the S curve because it has the form of an S when you look at a typical project. It may not always be the case, and in some cases I will replace the S curve by a straight line, but that's just for simplification and for proving some formulas. What we also can identify here is what we call the critical path position of the project. That's basically the relative position of the planned start and finish S curve related to the early start S curve and the late start S curve. And I already spoke about this before, so you already have seen this type of S curves. And basically, once we finish this, when we add all the elements to the S curve, we find the cost baseline, and the cost baseline will also be used to determine the project budget. We still have to have some reserves there, management reserves, risk-related contingency reserves, and things like that. Now we are at the end of the planning step. We still have to look at risk management. Now, it's not so sequential as you see here, because basically risk management we already do earlier. Whenever we look at all those steps that we are considering, we are looking at what risks can be there, but we don't always look at them at that moment. We still have to identify them. Now, at the end of the planning step, we've seen everything already, what can happen during the project. And we collected all that information, and that information will be used for risk management. Now, we have to be careful when we define risk management, because in general, when people talk about risk, they talk about negative events. Now, in project management, we look at positive opportunities and negative or threats that can influence at least, or that influence at least one of the project objectives: cost, time, scope, and quality. Now, it may be that there is a risk, but it may not be. It's possible that that risk is not a risk for our project because it has no effect on our cost, time, scope, and quality. Now, risk management is very important, and we have to evaluate all the measures, and we have to see what's going to happen. We have basically in the risk management process, we have different steps. We have qualification, quantification. So we may have a lot of elements that could be described as a risk, but we're going to evaluate which risks are in fact the risks that we have to consider during the project. Now, it is possible that we may find very high risks and risks that may endanger the project. We already did an initial risk evaluation when we looked at the charter, when we looked at the business case, but it is possible that we identify additional risks during the planning step. And in that case, we have to decide what's going to happen. is it still worthwhile to continue with the project, yes or no? Some project, even with a high risk factor, will be continued. Look at launching a man or a person into space. These are very risky events. Nevertheless, people did it. Those are high risk projects and people consider the risks. In other cases, you may say, well, the risk level is too high and we will not continue with the project. So basically that was here about the steps that we are considering, the steps related to the 10-step process in the planning step. So in the next video we will continue with the steps related to execution, monitoring, and control, and finally in closing. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you and bye-bye.